Awesome. Ed, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Obviously, we've gotten to know you a little bit fortuitously over the course of the last several months. Thank you for joining us here today on Conversations with Salem. For everyone listening here today, we got Ed Bellis. Ed has had a storied and successful career within cybersecurity, going from analyst to CISO, and then making the move over into the vendor space, become a successful cyber entrepreneur, and now is at a large cybersecurity company. And there's a lot of things to talk about here today, Ed, and look forward to get to know you a little more through this conversation. Anything else you want to share about yourself before we get into this?
No, thanks again for having me. I've obviously, as we've been talking over the last several months, I've become a bigger and bigger fan of what you guys are doing, and now I'm excited to have this conversation.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that, and thanks for taking the time here today. So, as you know, I've been learning a little bit more about cyber in general, and as I've been learning a lot more about cyber operations and alert triage, I've also been picking up some of the things that you've been publishing around vulnerability management. I think there's been a lot of parallels there. I certainly don't know a ton about vulnerabilities. I know enough to know that the shorthand is vuln. So thanks for tweeting that and teaching me more about that one. But really would like to understand a little bit more as we kind of get into this. What are vulnerabilities? What's vulnerability management? What's the problems that are associated with there? And kind of run the conversation in that direction. Sure. So man, starting with vulnerability. So start with an easy answer there.
Yeah, I don't know whether there's an easy answer, but right? I'll do my best. Thanks for teeing that up. So vulnerability you can think of as basically in our world, right? In cybersecurity, we're specifically talking about security vulnerabilities, usually in software or operating systems or firmware or things like that. And what it really means is it's some sort of weakness in that software that an attacker could take advantage of to do many different things. They could, ultimately exfiltrate data. They could run code on your machine with permissions. They could, do a denial of service. There's all kinds of different types of vulnerabilities, and that leads to impact of vulnerabilities. And there's a whole we even put surprisingly enough, as long as we've been around in this industry, there's still a lot of blurring of lines between when people say vulnerability versus risk versus threat versus threat actor, right? So there's a lot of different things to unpack there. But vulnerabilities is specifically the weakness. And typically when we're talking about vulnerabilities, like I said, we're talking about software weaknesses of some sort that an attacker could take advantage of.
Excellent. And this is certainly an area that you've been spending a lot of your career on recently and focusing there. As you've gotten more into the problem you probably saw in your prior roles and then focus more on this, would you mind sharing, what is the problems that people face when they try to address their vulnerabilities?
Sure. So to caveat, and I'll give a little bit more about my background that might help here in the conversation. Okay. So co-founder and CTO of Kenna Security. Yes, we're in the kind of risk-based vulnerability management space. We were acquired last year by Cisco, so part of that broader ecosystem now. But prior to that, I was the CISO at Orbitz, which was the online travel agency. And it's really kind of, I like to think of vulnerability management as stages of grief. So the first stage is ignorance is bliss. So go back 20 years or whatever, and pretty much most people didn't even know that they had vulnerabilities, or if they did, where they were, or that sort of thing. People started to invest in things like penetration testing and assessments and consulting services. There were some early vulnerability automated scanners that came out actually back in the late 90s, and they progressed over time. And that sort of category there is when you move away from ignorance is bliss to what I would say is vulnerability assessment, right? Where are my vulnerabilities and what are my vulnerabilities? So people started to do that, and as that really started to take off, and the problem that I ran into while I was at Orbitz was, oh my God, I have vulnerabilities, and they're all over the place, right? There's tons of vulnerabilities. And as you start to look at the different layers of your stack, right? Whether I'm looking at my infrastructure and the operating systems and the endpoints, or I'm looking at my applications and what makes up my applications and the vulnerabilities of those applications, or my third-party software or my open source that I'm using, all suddenly it all starts to kind of blur together, and you get overlaps and duplicates and false positives and false negatives still. So all of these things start to happen. And so, we had a team of people at Orbitz that were really just dedicated to kind of pouring through the results of all of these tools and processes and people to basically say, okay, here are all the vulnerabilities that we have. We've deduped them down, we've normalized them. There's still way more vulnerabilities than we actually have people to fix. So what are we going to prioritize here and make sure that we get done so that we are not, the victim of some sort of exploitation event or breach? And so they would go through and do that. We would get it, ticketed out, get it in the right people's hands, get patches out, fix software code in some cases, deploy all that, come back, reassess, and the pile actually grew by 10 to 15%. Not because we weren't doing things, because more things are continuously being introduced, new vulnerabilities are discovered on old things, and it just became more and more of a big giant pile of vulnerabilities, right? Yeah. So that process wasn't working, and hence I left to ultimately found Kenna and start to work on this risk-based approach to vulnerability management, which is to say, we got to stop counting vulnerabilities because there will always be vulnerabilities. In fact, there will be more and more vulnerabilities as tech proliferates throughout our lives. So how do we take this risk-based approach to make sure that I am driving down security risk with what I have? And obviously, the more I have, the more risk that I could potentially drive down. So that's what Kenna does, right? So we do all that in some sort of automated fashion. And I would say that's kind of holistically, you've got vulnerability assessment, then as part of vulnerability management, you've got the prioritization piece, which is a lot of what I was talking about with this risk-based approach. And then you've got the remediation piece, and that could be through automated patch management. That could be through simply software development, upgrades, end of life, decommissioning things, putting compensating controls upstream to block attacks against vulnerabilities. All of that kind of holistically represents what vulnerability management is. So it's a big process, a lot of people and a lot of tools that are involved in that.
Wow. Sounds rather overwhelming. That's wow.
Yes, it is.
Something that you said that I think we just kind of glazed over was this idea that you can't fix all vulnerabilities. And I think it's also worth saying, like, you're just talking about like known knowns when you say
that's
that,
right?
Like vulnerabilities that we're already aware of. Could you just talk a little bit of like why we can't just, if we know about them, why don't we just fix them all?
Yes, that's a great question. And to be honest, when everybody starts off in vulnerability assessment, including myself, I thought that was the answer, right? We'll find the things and then we'll fix the things. It turns out I've yet to see an org, and in fact, we do a joint research report with a group called the Scientia Institute, where we publish a lot of this data. And across hundreds of different orgs that we're looking at, we have enterprises that are Fortune 10, some of the biggest companies in the world. We have small SMBs that are 50-person companies, and everything in between. One of the things that's been interesting that we've tracked is what is an organization's capacity, right? So how many vulnerabilities on average on a monthly basis can they patch, can they fix, can they remediate? And the interesting thing is that no matter how big or small, how many resources they have, how little resources they have, how many vulnerabilities they have to deal with, how little vulnerabilities they have to deal with, it is almost a perfect straight line, statistically speaking, that they fix about 15% on a monthly basis. So that means that of the vulnerabilities that they have in their landscape that come in on a monthly basis, they'll fix 15% and they'll leave 85% open. The top performers are probably double that, 30%. The bottom performers are obviously in the low single digits. And you're talking about some orgs who have hundreds of millions of vulnerabilities, and you're talking about some orgs that have hundreds of vulnerabilities. And the size did not matter at all.
I wonder, do you think that there's any sort of correlation between that 15% figure and our natural desire to put work on like a priority spectrum from lowest priority to highest priority? and then kind of like an influence of like policy. Like I have a policy, I'm going to fix all vulnerabilities that are critical, and they get critical because they're the top 15%, and then all of a sudden that's the number. Like, am I just making that up, or do you think
I would love for that to be true. I think what you'll find is 90% of the orgs out there aren't living up to, if they have a policy, they're not living up to it. In fact, I would say probably the most common thing out there that I've seen is people use something called CVSS, or the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, to rank their vulnerabilities. It's standardized. It comes out of the National Vulnerability Database run by NIST. And most people seem to have, that I've seen at least, have a policy that roughly says, for CVSS 7 and above, so it's a 1 to 10 scale, so 7, 8s, 9s, and 10s, I need to fix those within X number of days, whether that's 30 days or 60 days or whatever the case might be. The problem is that when you look at the distribution of CVSS scores across all vulnerabilities, the average vulnerability is greater than a 7, right? Meaning that's you would probably have to, if your policy was fix 7 and above, you're probably fixing about 60% of your vulnerabilities, which almost nobody is doing. If you're 6 and above, you're probably at 80% of your vulnerabilities, right? There's almost nothing that's a 1, 2, or 3. So I remember going back at my days at Orbitz, we used to have to, so everyone familiar with PCI, or the payment card industry's compliance initiatives around, I process credit cards, so there's a bunch of things I have to do that are related to security and compliance. So the predecessor to that was MasterCard had their own program called SDP. Visa had a program, blanking on what that was, and then Amex was doing nothing and then something. But they then formed this thing called PCI, and the first thing they did around vulnerabilities was they said, you must fix everything that's a CVSS 4 and above, which is basically just saying you must fix all your vulnerabilities. So that doesn't happen. Now, I will say that there's a caveat here, and the data that we're looking at is across Kenna customers, right? So there's some bias in that data set. One is they've already gotten to the point where they said, hey, I can't fix everything. I need to take a risk-based approach to this, right? So who knows? Maybe we have this total blind spot that there's organizations out there that are fixing everything. I've seen some of the biggest, really well-run tech companies that have come to us as well, and they're not fixing 100%. So I would find it very hard to believe that there's many people at all that are fixing 100% of their vulnerabilities out there. I do think that a lot of it has to do with how easy or hard it is to fix vulnerabilities. So one of the things that we see is the organizations will come in and they'll have a set of vulnerabilities that they do fix, no matter what the score is. I don't really care what the risk is. It's easy for me to fix. It's part of my Microsoft Patch Tuesday process. And I come out and I've got automated patch management in place. Every month I get the sets of vulnerabilities. I push out the patches, I test them, and away I go. And that takes care of maybe 10, 20% of all of the vulnerabilities that I have across my organization. Now I got to prioritize the rest because they get increasingly difficult depending on what they are. Like example of fixing a Java vulnerability where all of a sudden I've got to upgrade Java, which means I also got to do a whole bunch of regression testing on all of my code and all of the applications that are running Java, and that is a much messier problem. So I think that does play a role in it. I don't think it's entirely the problem, but there's definitely something there.
One of the pieces you touched on, you call it the best versus the worst, just in terms of percentage. Do you see anything that differs, the best in terms of overall effectiveness? Is that the right word for this? In terms of who are doing the best of actually managing their vulnerabilities? Is percentage obviously a big factor, or is it a smaller one, or what are some other things that play into there?
That's a great segue, Trevor. Thank you for mentioning that, because we just came out with some features in Kenna to measure.
No, I swear I didn't know that.
I did not plant that in. And it's actually based on some of that research that I was referring to earlier. there's really 4 key metrics that we're measuring around. So there's risk, right, which is key to, we're basically just measuring what is the likelihood of an exploitation event and the impact of that exploitation event for any group of assets that you have. And we kind of categorize that within a risk score. But separately from that, what we wanted to do is measure how are teams and organizations doing, because risk plays a role in that. But it's not entirely that, and risk is not completely in control of that organization either, right? So example is I'm doing a really good job. I don't have any vulnerabilities that are, being exploited, that have an exploit associated with them and so forth. But tomorrow we detect a big campaign come out that's suddenly exploiting one of the vulnerabilities they have, and the risk goes up there. They're still doing a good job. They got to refocus their efforts, but it's different. So we look at 4 metrics: coverage and efficiency. And really, for all the machine learning folks in the audience, you can think of it as precision and recall. But really what it is so coverage on a vulnerability aspect, you could say, if I have 100 high-risk vulnerabilities, and how many of those did I actually fix? So if I had 100 and I fixed 70, then I've got 70% coverage. Efficiency is the opposite of that. I went out and fixed 100 vulnerabilities. How many of them were actually high risk, right? Versus things that I could have been spending my time doing something else in security and getting a better bang for my buck result. Then there's what we've been talking about, which is capacity. How many vulnerabilities am I capable of actually fixing? And that actually ends up driving, you start to look at what you basically look at your baseline and you say, okay, here's what I'm capable of doing. How many high risk vulns do I have out there? Am I capable of actually remediating all my high risk vulns? And the answer usually is yes. Most organizations, while they're only fixing 15% or so of their vulns, I would say about 15% or so of vulns are actually high risk. So to your point earlier, John, if that lines up right and they're prioritizing right, that works out well. And then the fourth one is velocity, meaning how fast am I burning down any given result or any given vulnerability. Now, a lot of times in our industry, we look at things like mean time to remediate, which is okay, except on a vulnerability basis. Typically, when somebody measures or talks about their mean time to remediation, they're talking about what they actually remediate. So if I had 100 vulns and I fixed 3 of them and I was super fast and it took me 3 days, then I've got a mean time to remediate of 3 days, but I've left 97% of my vulnerabilities open. Yeah. So we end up looking at survival curves. So think of it almost like a disease, right? Where the vulnerability is in this case, survival curves in the disease world. Usually you want people to survive, right? So you want those curves to be big and slow. Vulnerabilities are the opposite. You don't want them to survive, right? So you want them steep and fast, right? So that area under the curve where you drop something out and eradicate a vuln out of your environment, that's what you're looking for in terms of like a remediation velocity.
Excellent. Wow. Thank you for that. I did not know that you guys just launched some more features around that, but it's very interesting. It seems just one part of that, going back to one part you mentioned earlier, is like how organizations actually then deal with this. It seems like, discipline, you mentioned like having a weekly, monthly process, but also still being dynamic are very key. It seems like also technology has really changed the game around having data, not just inside your institution, but also coming from what else has happened in industry to help inform the dynamic piece is really important. What, beyond just Kenna, how has technology really advanced the notion around vulnerability management?
Yeah, sure. I spent a lot of time on the Kenna side, which is mostly around the reporting and prioritization of vulnerabilities, right? And obviously vulnerability assessment is also key. If you don't know about vulnerabilities, then you obviously can't fix those. And John talked a little bit about the known knowns and the unknowns, right? There's vulnerabilities I don't know about. There's also kind of this emerging category of like attack surface management that's come out, and specifically external attack surface management, where they end up finding assets and websites and different things that you owned that you might have not even known. They're not in your managed category, right? So we're starting to see things come up there. Obviously, I find an asset, it's out on the internet. sure enough, it belongs to my company and it's got a vulnerability on it. Hey, this is a critical vulnerability. The next step in the process, and I haven't yet seen somebody solve this very well, at least through technology, is, okay, I know about this asset now. I know I've got this vulnerability. I know how to fix it, except I don't know who actually fixes it because I don't know who owns this asset, right? So that is going to be an interesting problem. Now, there's the whole remediation side and the control side of the house. We've seen more and more automation of patch management come out. Microsoft, as I mentioned them earlier, they do a really good job. Actually, they're on one hand, they are probably the single largest producer of software vulnerabilities in the world, but they have also created a great process and a lot of tooling around actually fixing and keeping these things up to date. So when you look at them across the board, actually, when you look at the velocity of remediation, they do the best of any of the vendors that we saw, including Google, by the way, which also does an excellent job. But most of the vulnerabilities that we are seeing in terms of in the enterprise and in networks tends to be, as relates to Google, is usually Chrome vulnerabilities. So I also find it a little bit entertaining because what that means to me is people do a little bit better job of pushing out a patch through Microsoft SCCM than they do restarting their browser, because restarting your browser, the auto update is actually going to fix those vulnerabilities. So auto update has become a big thing. Microsoft's doing it. Google's doing it. A lot of software vendors are doing it. That's helped quite a bit as well. There's a lot to be done though.
It sounds like you run into human problems there at the end, because I know if you looked at vulnerabilities in a non-technical sense, I'm probably a vulnerability, right?
Trevor, you are definitely a vulnerability.
Involved in the sense that I've got to press a button. Now I've got to do something to actually then, I got 15 tabs open. I don't want to restart that or lose any of my progress or whatever it is. And I think they've definitely advanced the features now where it kind of brings back where it left off, which is then helps someone like me not be as big of a vulnerability as I was before, maybe.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And there's definitely plenty of humans in the loop still, which is an interesting problem in itself. There's also like cottage industries of other areas that are kind of adjacent to vuln management. Breach and attack simulation comes to mind, where it's more like what they're doing isn't necessarily vuln management directly, but they're doing controls testing, right? So you can almost think of them as like the automated pen tester in some way. It's like, okay, I've got this vulnerability, but I also have these upstream controls through, a firewall or an IPS or something like that. Am I actually protected against that attack or not? And they can kind of test through it. So think of that as some of the automated testing that goes on. I think you'll see more and more of those types of adjacent industries start to merge together too.
Okay.
One of the things that I've noticed that is really interesting, going back to your like browser problem, is all the browsers now put like a little update button in the corner of your browser, and it like changes colors depending on how long it's been since you've hit update. And then we get on Zoom calls with people and they're sharing their screen and you see that they haven't updated their browser. Yeah. And as a security person, like I always like to shame them, like, hey, maybe you should just go, hit that button. Like, it'll load your tabs again. It'll be all right. Just go hit that button.
Aren't that exactly. And that's the other thing is it used to be where I remember it was a pain to get your tabs back. It's super easy to get your tabs back now, right?
That's been the last 6-12 months. Yeah, so John, yeah. I was one of those people that John shamed before. So,
speaking of the humans,
right? I think this also inspire a good conversation for John and I off air later around what our vulnerability management looks like and what do we have? Because
you want to know what our vulnerability management looks like. We're using, I guess I won't name them, but like the vendor that we're using sends us like reports on like fix these things. Every single one of them is a CVS 9.8. Every single one that comes through is a CVS 9.8. And I don't know exactly how they're picking the ones that they're prioritizing, but like,
9.8 sounds high on a scale of 10.
Right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yep. We got a guy on our team, Jerry Gamblin, who kind of heads up the research side of the house for Kenna. He has this open site called, I think it's cve.icu, where he's pouring through and giving you a bunch of different views of these vulnerabilities through the lens of things like CVSS. And you'll start to really see just how skewed everything is to the right? There's almost, the old adage of if everything is important then nothing is fits perfectly here.
Okay. Well, Ed, thank you for sharing a lot more about vulnerability management and getting me up to speed there. And it's definitely very interesting. I would like to move the conversation a bit more towards about you and what you've learned in your career as you've been advancing and changing in different ways. Maybe we'll start with some of the parallels I think that especially you and John have, coming from like a technical background and then going down more of the entrepreneurial and then executive paths. Would you mind jumping in there and sharing a little bit about what that switch looked like? Why did you make that move? What kind of inspired you? And then some of the things you've learned along the way.
Sure. It was definitely not a overnight thing I went from A to B. It was a meandering journey, I would say. So if you go all the way back, so first job out of school was as a Unix, not Linux, because Linux wasn't really a thing. Unix systems administrator, right? So I worked for a company called CSC, Computer Science Corporation, which they got. They were, among other things, a large government contractor. And it was my job just to do Unix systems administration on things like data generals and whoops. Did I lose you guys or are you still here?
It's a great commercial break. Sponsored by Salem Cyber.
Here it is. Hey, I'm back.
Hey, Ed.
Excellent. All right. So where were we? We were talking about kind of my journey from practitioner ultimately into being a founder. So I started off my career as a Unix systems administrator at a company called CSC, Computer Science Corporation. Did that for a number of years, and then that was kind of in the early days of the internet. And I decided after a few years there to go and start to work directly on things that were on the internet. And I grew up in Detroit, so I was still living in Detroit at the time. So of course, naturally, it was my job to go get a job over at a large automotive company. So I went and worked at Ford Motor Company for a while. And we were building out back then basically what was an intranet, I guess, at the time, or extranet, I should say, which was connectivity between Ford and all of their suppliers. And we were building out basically all of the things that allowed them to transact with each other. And then that ended up getting spun out, and it ended up being the big three in all of their suppliers. So General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, plus all of their suppliers. And it was there where I first started to dabble in security, and specifically was building out a bunch of authentication and authorization systems for all of these suppliers to work with the big three automotive companies. Did that for a little bit and then decided to go work for one of their vendors and started building out web applications. This was now in the late 90s, the halcyon days of Internet 1.0. And we started building out lots of different web apps for this company's customers. So and at the time, still in Detroit, so their customers were largely Ford, Lincoln, and Mercury. And then I took the opportunity to go run all of interactive services for this company for Latin America. So I moved down to Miami and started doing it for all of their Latin American clients down there as MasterCard, Citibank, a bunch of large financial services companies and things like that. So we were doing that. And then, let's see, so I was in Miami for just over a year and decided to take a role with a joint venture. And this was right at the height of the bubble of the first internet bubble. And so I ended up taking a job that was a joint venture between Sprint and Ernst & Young. And this was in Chicago. So that's when I first moved to Chicago. I've been here ever since. And it was basically building out J2Me applications, so mobile applications back then for flip phones. And I started actually working full-time in security on that, basically application security, mostly with some of the infrastructure that we were in charge of running there. did that for a while until the bubble burst. And basically at that point, they decided to sell to Capgemini, another large consulting company, made us all consultants. I did that for a very small amount of time, did not like that at all. Left there, did a little bit of independent stuff, and then went to Bank of America to work on full-time on security, specifically on authentication and authorization, again, mostly around identity management and things like that, but specifically for their GCIB group, Global Corporate and Investment Banking arm. So it was not all the consumer stuff, it was all the investment banking stuff. Did that, and that's when I came up with the opportunity to go run security at a little company called Orbitz, the online travel company, which was also based in Chicago at the time. So I went there, did that, and as I said, described earlier, so I was at Orbitz for about 6.5 years. And I would say, so all this time, so if I look at that journey, that was about 18 years worth of practitioner employment. And then at that point is like, so one of the things I would attribute to me jumping ship, other than to say I ran into this vulnerability management problem that I thought somebody else had solved and no one had. But in addition to that, it was really the culture at Orbitz, right? It was very entrepreneurial to begin with. In fact, if you look at, there was an article that came out probably about a year or so after I left Orbitz, and it was basically an article in Crane Chicago that talked about this network of people that had all left Orbitz and started their own companies. And at the time, there was probably 20 some plus companies that people had left and started, and probably, 40, 50 of those by now, I would think, maybe even more. It was really an entrepreneurial culture that just kind of led you to want to go out and do something on your own, and that's kind of been the journey. Wow.
Maybe I should ask the question, what have you not done cyber? My make sure list.
There's plenty now, right? I feel like it's amazing just, having left and starting Kenna at basically the beginning of 2011. I think about, the space, how much it's grown, how much it's changed, how many new categories are out there now that didn't exist back in 2011. Heck, just walking the RSA show floor now versus walking it 10 years ago, it's like there's probably 5 times as many vendors now as there were back then.
When we saw you at this last one, and it was wild.
Yeah, right. It's chaotic. And that's just now starting to ramp back up post-COVID, right? I think it was 2019 was probably the biggest year I saw it, but we're getting pretty close again.
Awesome. So then you made that move, and now you're an entrepreneur at Kenna, and obviously you've found a problem, and you think you've got an idea of how to solve it, and being able to actually approach that. Can you tell us a little about your journey of how you went from that stage then to actually addressing that problem with someone, and then scaling that solution later to others?
Yeah, again, a little bit of a meandering journey there too, right? So we started out as like, okay, the first thing we got to do is kind of do the table stakes of this, right? Which is to say, before we can make sense of all of this data and prioritize what vulnerabilities need to fix and everything else, we got to be able to consume all of that. We got to do all that messy grunt work that I was talking about earlier that somebody was doing at Orbitz in terms of normalizing deduplication, flagging false positive, that sort of thing. I got to be able to do that for my customers. And that's just to get the data, right? So that was probably in itself a couple of years of just building out integrations, data normalization, building out what is now seen as a fairly complex data model to do all this stuff. And then it was like, we knew we had to prioritize, but we didn't know what that answer was yet, right? We were figuring that out as we went. So we would go through, I ended up hiring a gentleman who's still with us today, Michael Reutman, who's our chief data scientist. Turned out to be a fantastic hire. And we started kind of going through and figuring out how are we going to ultimately prioritize this. And part of it was luck. So we raised a seed round of funding in 2011, led by somebody named Tugboat Ventures. And Tugboat brought in, as part of their diligence, a guy by the name of Roger Thornton. At the time, Roger was one of the co-founders of Fortify Software, which is software that goes out and, Fortify Software finds bugs or vulnerabilities in your software, specifically in application side of the house. They ended up getting bought by HP, but he came in and he was sitting in on the due diligence, sat in on all the pitches and everything else, and kind of helped Tugboat along the way on making their decision to invest in what is now Kenna. Anyway, fast forward to, I think it was 2013, 2012, late 2012. I'm not sure. I think 2013. I got a call from Roger, and Roger was going to the RSA show that we were just talking about. So where were we? So he wanted to meet up, and so I met with him while we were at RSA, and now he had left HP and now was at Alien Bolt. Which was they create a SIM, a security information and event management. Obviously, you guys know SIM well, and they are mostly geared towards, I would say, kind of the smaller end of the market, not the large enterprise of the market. But anyway, they were saying, "Hey, we're actually have started to build out this thing where our customers have opted in to us collecting all of this telemetry." And we're going to start this thing called the Open Threat Exchange. And here it's got a bunch of data, and here's what it has. But one of the things that it has in here is attacks on vulnerabilities. Is this anything that would be useful to you guys? Of course. Yeah, that would be great. So we started looking at it, and then we started to consume it, and we built an integration into it. And then sure enough, I was talking to Roger later, and he goes, well, I thought, I was talking to him about this is great that we have all of this attack data and things like that. He said, well, it's actually a little bit more than just attack data, because we have access to not only the IPS IDS that's getting triggered in terms of the signature for that CVE, but we have access to the asset too. And we know that CVE, that vulnerability actually exists on that asset too. And we actually have access to some post data like IOCs and different things like that lead us to believe whether or not that was actually a successful exploitation. So this turned out to be really great for us. And that was really kind of the early days of us prioritizing vulnerabilities and the early days of us actually finding product market fit, because we went from organizing data, but stuff that you already had and kind of a nice to have, to giving you a view of what's going on outside of your four walls as it relates to your own vulnerabilities and your own infrastructure, right? So that was a view that our customers had never had before. And we were able to say, hey, these are the ones here that are likely to get hit next. So we started doing that, and then we started adding more and more intel, and we started, creating our own sensors. We started partnering with other commercial providers, et cetera, and really starting to bolster that side of the house so that when a customer loaded their vulnerabilities in, instantaneously we could say, here's the 10, 15, 18, 12%, whatever it is. These are the things you got to focus on. And that was a big deal for us for sure.
So you're a threat intelligence company.
We like to say we bake the intel in, right? Where basically you bring us your vulnerabilities, you bring us information about your assets. We'll include the intel, but it's important to have that holistic view, right? So the intel-centric piece of it is one piece of it, but I also need to know a lot about your asset, right? I need to know about, is it exposed to the internet? I need to know how important it is, what it's running, who owns it. All of these different things all matter too, and how they relate to each other. Because ultimately what we're doing is we're risk assessing not just the vulnerability, but we're risk assessing the asset, the groups of assets, or the organization.
Yeah, there's so many parallels to what we're trying to do. And I think the word we always come back to is like relevancy, like what is relevant to you. And I think what's really cool about your story is bringing in additional context to judge that relevance, because just rebaking the cake with the data that the client has, it doesn't really give you anything new except for a cool dashboard that you can show when you're selling a product that nobody's going to click on again.
Rebaking the cake is a great term there. That's exactly what it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that context is actually something that's huge, because it sounds like there's a lot of context to be gained that could be found in data. A lot of it too, that especially that we've been finding, a lot of it tends to be human based, as in it's this oral history. I think, John, is the terminology you like to use here. But have you been able to attack that part of the problem and find a good way to incorporate that type of context?
Not so much. I think we are 100% kind of looking at both the technical aspects of the asset and the vulnerability, and in some cases the controls around the asset and that sort of thing. But we have not really delved a whole lot into kind of the human aspects. It's one of the things that I'm a big believer in what you guys are doing. And this is more of my opinion on the broader cybersecurity market and problem as a whole, which is to say anybody who's out there, if you look at it, we talked earlier about, orgs are fixing roughly 15% of their vulnerabilities. Guess what? That's not unique to vulnerability management, right? I think if you look at it, we have this problem where there's way more work to be done than there are people to actually do that work, right? And so if you can somehow bring a solution to market that helps with that, and you guys certainly do that, I think there's plenty of opportunity there. And I think there's a number of levers that, startups, but also organizations have at their disposal to kind of deal with that problem. One is kind of what we're doing on the prioritization front, what you're doing a little bit more on the AI front, basically being able to assist folks in doing their jobs. So there's that aspect. There's the automation aspect, right, which is do more with machines. And then there's probably a third in there, which is a little bit softer, but it's the training, it's the hiring, it's the bringing in people into cybersecurity that aren't necessarily cybersecurity people. I used to be a big believer in that when I was at Orbitz, right? It's not only, you can't just hire from the cybersecurity market, right? You got to be able to, if I need a good AppSec person, maybe the best person to do that job is an application developer. If I need a good OpSec person, maybe there's somebody in tech operations. If there's somebody I need to do in compliance, maybe I need to bring in an auditor. But we used to do that with tools too. We used to look at, we had marketing tools where you were actually, sorry, not marketing, it was customer service tools that were looking at click streams of what customers were doing on the website. And that was to see if they were running into problems. But we could reuse that same tool set to see, are there people skipping steps unusually, right? Are there people that are doing unusual things on the website that maybe we should take a closer look from a security perspective? So I think being able to repurpose people and repurpose tooling to solve that problem is also a big help.
That makes a lot of sense. And you essentially already answered probably most of my next question anyways. It sounds like some of the things I've garnered from today is that the market has changed a lot over time. There's certainly a dynamic nature to it, and that people obviously are very critical to it, and there's nowhere near enough given in many different ways. There's so much work to be done, but not enough people to do it. If you might just expand there, this last, where do you see cyber evolving from here? And just more broadly, given that you've had several different experiences from, obviously analyst, leader, practitioner, vendor, executive, et cetera.
Yeah. So I definitely think that there's a big opportunity for anybody who's using any of those levers, frankly, to address the lack of people to solve those problems. Additionally, I think of it as, and this is kind of an unfortunate situation for security, but it's been a reality for a long time, which is to say new technology is always coming out, right? And then post that new technology, it's like, oh, crap, we got to secure this. We didn't even think about that, right? So whether it be IoT is a lot that's come up recently. And then I would tell you that really was sort of catching on, but it wasn't a huge space until the people that are running things like IoT started to suffer from availability issues, in this case, mostly because of ransomware. And it turns out in some organizations, a lot of the manufacturing organizations that are running IoT, availability is way more important than confidentiality or integrity. So, and in that case, that suddenly became a hot area. I see things all the time now around kind of the supply chain, right? And SolarWinds was a big driver of that, but that's just one piece of probably a very deep and complex problem that we have, which is when I look at the software that we're writing or the software that we're delivering, probably 80 to 90% of it was not actually written by any of our developers. So how do I, keep a hold of the controls around that, the vulnerabilities around that, any sort of issues? There's going to be I feel like there's constantly new tech that's coming out, which is great. But then there's the moment of, now we got to figure out how do we secure that and how do we bake that in the future, right? So it's like this evolving cottage industry of new things that are coming out. I don't see that ending anytime soon. They're probably accelerating. And then the last thing I would add on top of that, which is, we always talk about, there's always lots of attention on the new, the hot, what's coming out now. But the other things aren't going away, right? Yeah. There's more legacy environments than there have ever been, and that will continue every single day. I feel like, if you count, I forget what site it is that actually does things like counts the number of websites that are on the internet. People aren't taking websites down; they're just building new ones, right? Same with assets, new technology, new servers, new everything that's out there. So it just becomes a bigger and bigger issue.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, Ed, we really appreciate you coming on here today, and thank you for sharing your experiences and also teaching us a few things along the way, especially me on the vulnerability side. Really appreciate it. I think there's a lot of excitement for what's going to happen in the future because, like you mentioned, so much is changing and there's so many problems left to solve. So really appreciate the time again, and thank you for joining us, Ed.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks.
You too.